Chapter 1. The Letter from Windermere Heath. It was on a gray and drizzling morning in late October that I found myself seated opposite Sherlock Holmes at breakfast in our shared quarters at 221B Baker Street. Outside, a chill fog clung to the windows, obscuring the familiar outline of the opposite buildings. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, but even it seemed hesitant to challenge the dampness that crept in beneath the doors. Holmes, as usual, was buried in a monograph, this one on the peculiarities of monastic poisons used in the 14th century. When a knock came at the door, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the Morning Post, setting a modest stack of envelopes at Holmes's elbow and glancing briefly at me with her usual air of unspoken curiosity. From Windermere Heath, Holmes muttered a moment later, holding up an envelope bearing the thick, ornate wax seal of an aristocratic family, an unusual stamp. "Do you recognize the crest, Watson?" I leaned forward and studied it, a silver hawk embossed against a background of crossed branches. "No, I can't say that I do," I replied, "though the address seems familiar." Holmes slid open the envelope and unfolded the accompanying letter. His keen eyes flicked across the page, and I watched as his expression shifted ever so slightly, stillness overtaking his usual dry amusement. "Well?" I prompted, leaning forward. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Very curious indeed. Watson, how does the idea of a weekend in the mist-shrouded moors appeal to you?" "I'm game," I said cautiously, "though I confess I'd prefer to know more before packing a valise." Holmes handed me the letter. "Here, judge for yourself." I took the sheet and read, "My dear Mr. Holmes, you will no doubt forgive the abruptness of this invitation. I write to you under circumstances most distressing and increasingly unnerving. I am Lady Beatrice Lonsdale, widow of Sir Giles Lonsdale of Windermere Heath, a remote estate on the outskirts of Surrey. Over the past fortnight, events at the manor have taken a most sinister turn, doors opening of their own accord, ghastly sounds in the night, and most disturbingly, the disappearance of our old groundskeeper, Mr. Fulbright, last seen entering the mist near the East Orchard and never emerging. Local authorities have dismissed it as a simple case of a senile old man losing his way. But I am not so easily convinced. Mr. Holmes, there are things within this house, within its very walls, that breathe of secrets, and I fear something long buried has begun to stir again. I implore you to come. I have enclosed a rail ticket and arranged transport from the Windermere station. I can offer you and Dr. Watson rooms at the manor and every hospitality, but I must ask you to come with discretion. My family is proud, and I dare not alarm the staff or my late husband's brother, who now oversees the estate's accounts. Time is of the essence. Respectfully yours, Lady Beatrice Lonsdale." I looked up, the letter trembling slightly between my fingers. "This sounds more like a ghost story than a crime, Holmes." "Precisely," said Holmes, rising. "Which is what makes it all the more intriguing. When people speak of ghosts, Watson, they are often trying very hard not to speak of something else. You suspect foul play?" "I suspect," Holmes replied with a glint in his eye, "that something is very much amiss at Windermere Manor, and not of a supernatural nature." Within the hour, Holmes had packed his worn leather case, and I had followed suit. The rain continued in a soft drizzle as we descended the steps of Baker Street and hailed a cab to the station. As we rattled toward Victoria, I noted Holmes was unusually quiet. His long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze turned toward the window, though I doubted he saw anything beyond the mist. "Do you know anything of the Lonsdale family?" I asked. "Only what I've gleaned from the obituary columns and an old dispatch in the Times, some 5 years ago. Sir Giles Lonsdale, a man of considerable estate, but little public acclaim, died under somewhat vague circumstances. A heart seizure, I believe, though the notice was unusually brief for a man of his rank." "And his widow?" "Lady Beatrice was a Miss Eleonora Talbot before her marriage, a woman of sharp mind and impeccable breeding. if society pages are to be trusted, her name disappeared from the pages after Sir Giles's death, which tells me she has been keeping quietly in the country. What of the brother? Ah, yes, Holmes said with a brief smile. Algernon Lonsdale, an accountant. By profession and according to public company records, a man with a hand in several minor railway ventures. No great scandals, but I find it odd that Lady Beatrice would find his presence, cause for discretion. It was late afternoon when our train finally hissed into the station at Windermere, a bleak, wind-blown platform almost swallowed by encroaching fog. A coach awaited us, drawn by two gray horses and driven by a sullen-looking man in a stiff oilskin coat. He tipped his hat, but said nothing as we boarded. The ride from the station to the manor was eerily silent. The road wound through moorland blanketed in mist so thick that even the trees loomed like shadowy giants, blurred and indistinct. From time to time, I thought I glimpsed old stone walls or broken gateposts, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. Unsettling countryside, I muttered. Unsettling, yes, Holmes agreed. And yet, nature rarely conceals secrets unless man places them there. The manor revealed itself slowly, first as a vague bulk in the fog, then as a looming silhouette of gables, turrets, and ivy-covered stone. As we drew closer, I noticed a curious detail. A broken window on the second floor, the jagged glass still in the frame, as if it had been smashed from within. Lady Beatrice received us in the great hall, a tall woman in her late 40s, dressed in muted morning attire. Her dark eyes, intelligent and searching, lingered on Holmes before flicking briefly to me. Her grip was firm, but her voice held a tremor beneath its politeness. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you have no idea how grateful I am that you came. I trust we're not too late, Holmes said, bowing slightly. No, though I fear something waits for no one, she replied. You'll find this house is not as quiet as it seems, and the mist has not lifted in over a week. We were shown to our rooms by an elderly butler named Merriweather, whose sunken eyes gave him the look of a man permanently in mourning. The halls were long and dark, lined with ancestral portraits, many of which seemed to glare down at us with disdain or warning. I could not help but shiver as we passed a particularly large painting of Sir Giles Lonsdale himself, his face pale and pinched, his eyes suspicious and narrow. Later, over a modest supper in the dining room, Lady Beatrice explained further. It began with the orchard, she said quietly. Strange rustlings at night, then the cries, short, sharp cries, as though someone were being pulled through brambles. And then Mr. Fulbright ... he simply vanished, left his lantern burning at the foot of the orchard path. Holmes sipped his wine, and the broken window upstairs? Lady Beatrice stiffened. That came later, the night after Fulbright disappeared. The window shattered during a calm night. No storm, no wind, nothing visible outside. The glass was blown inward. And your brother-in-law? Algernon believes I've let the house fall into disrepair, she said bitterly. He's even suggested I sell the manor and move to London, but this is my home. I won't be frightened out by shadows. Holmes nodded. Good, because shadows rarely act alone. As the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10, Holmes and I retired to our adjoining rooms. I stood for a while at the frost-veiled window, staring out into the swirling mist, wondering what it was that moved unseen in the orchards of Windermere. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted somewhere else, perhaps nearer than I wished something else moved softly, stealthily through the fog, and the case, though not yet begun in earnest, had already wrapped its chill fingers around us. Chapter 2, The Letter from Wiltshire. It was a week later when the Morning Post brought a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a pressed coat of arms that neither Holmes nor I recognized at first glance. Holmes, lounging in his dressing gown and seated cross-legged on the hearthrug with a Persian slipper of tobacco in hand, gave it only a cursory glance before flicking it toward me. curious crest," he remarked. "Open it, Watson. I trust. Your instincts will tell us whether it is worthy of our time." The envelope was addressed in a careful, archaic hand to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. I broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper. The contents were brief but precise, composed with a kind of restrained desperation that instantly caught my attention. "My dear Mr. Holmes, I am most urgently in need of your expertise in a matter both delicate and grave. I beg you to come to us at once, should your engagements permit. Strange happenings have occurred at my family estate, Morden Grange, and I fear matters may soon turn deadly. You will be received with the utmost discretion. Yours in sincerity, Catherine Ellery Morden." Grange, Wiltshire. I read the letter aloud. Holmes's expression sharpened as I finished. "Morden Grange," he murmured, staring into the fire. "It rings a distant bell. Ellery, not an insignificant name. Wiltshire, you say?" He stood abruptly and went to the shelf above the mantel, withdrawing a thick volume of county genealogies. His fingers danced nimbly across the pages. "Ah, here we are. The Ellerys of Morden Grange. Old landed stock, minor nobility once, prosperous, now likely clinging to tradition more than fortune. The current master, Sir Aldous Ellery, inherited the estate some 20 years ago. A recluse, if I recall." "Then it is Lady Catherine who wrote to you?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Most likely his daughter." The urgency in her tone is unmistakable. And note the phrase, "strange happenings." We are not being summoned to chase a burglar or investigate a missing heirloom. Something more elusive is at play. I studied Holmes's face and knew the case had already taken hold of him. That glint of mental excitement, the quiet energy in his limbs, these were the sure signs that Sherlock Holmes was engaged. "What do you make of the timing?" I asked. "Why wait until now to seek your help?" "Excellent, Watson." "Precisely. The question we must ask upon arrival. For now we must assume that matters have progressed beyond what the family is able to contain on their own. And do you believe it may be criminal?" Holmes smiled without mirth. "You are thinking, as I hoped you would. Whether it is criminal or not, the desperation is genuine, and I never ignore genuine desperation when it wears the veil of mystery." Within an hour, we were packed and aboard the early train to Wiltshire, the heavy clouds outside matching the murky apprehension that clung to our new case. Holmes spent much of the journey in silence, gazing through the window as the countryside rushed past in swaths of mist and motion. I meanwhile jotted some impressions of our recent case for possible publication and read over Lady Catherine's letter again, seeking any hidden implication in the line's dot as we drew nearer to our destination. The terrain grew wilder. The trees seemed older, their limbs draped with moss, and hedgerows marked boundaries that hadn't changed in generations. When we finally arrived at the small station of Kintmere Halt, we found no one awaiting us. Holmes turned to the station master, who was sweeping the platform with more devotion than necessary. "I believe a carriage from Morden Grange was meant to collect us." The man, startled by Holmes's voice, removed his cap. "Beg pardon, sir, but Miss Ellery sent word said something delayed them. A stable boy's on his way, now with a cart. You'll not mind waiting a moment?" Holmes inclined his head. "Not at all. These country delays are often more telling than they appear." As we waited, I observed Holmes pacing slowly along the platform, his gaze flicking between the stone walls, the rail tracks, and the shifting fog that pressed against the station like a living thing. "Notice anything, Watson?" he asked without turning. "Only that our reception has been poorly timed." "Indeed, but more than that, it was not merely delayed, it was misjudged. Look at the cart approaching now." I saw a young lad of about 16 trotting up with a rickety cart pulled by a mottled gray horse. He looked nervous, his cap tugged down low, and his eyes darting everywhere. "But at us. Double quotes, Mr. Holmes, sir." "ESTAMMERED. Double quotes, yes. We were told you." "We're delayed," the boy swallowed. It weren't supposed to be me. Mr. Carter, the coachman, he's missing. Disappeared last night, they say. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Disappeared? Without a word? Yes, sir. And what's worse, he left the carriage out by the western paddock, harness still on and all, but no sign of him. Was anyone sent to look? They did, sir. Some of the hands went out with lanterns. Nothing found but a broken watch chain and his hat in the reeds by the edge of the orchard. Holmes and I exchanged a look. The first ripple had already broken the surface. Drive us to the manor, Holmes instructed. We'll speak more. On the way, the road to Morden Grange wound through ancient woodland, where gnarled oaks hunched together as if sharing secrets. The mist clung to every branch and stone, turning the air into a silvery veil. When the house finally emerged from the gloom, it was like something half-remembered from a dream, an imposing gray manor, with tall, narrow windows and ivy running wild across its stone facade as the cart jostled up the long gravel path. Great front doors opened. A tall woman in a dark gown stood on the threshold, hands clasped tightly at her waist. Her features were striking, high cheekbones, keen blue eyes, and a posture honed by generations of nobility, but worn by present anxiety. She descended the steps quickly as we dismounted. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson?" she said, her voice firm but laced with unease. Holmes bowed. "Miss Ellery, I presume. You have our attention." And already more questions than we had anticipated. She gave a brief, strained smile. "You'll have more still by nightfall, I fear. Please come inside. There's something you must see at once." Holmes offered his arm, and as she led us through the heavy doors into the shadowed halls of Morden Grange, the weight of mystery seemed to settle upon our shoulders, like the very mist we had left behind. Chapter 3. Footsteps in the West Wing. Morden Grange, once a proud emblem of the Ellery lineage, had about it a stillness not born merely of isolation, but of watchfulness. As Miss Catherine Ellery led us into the drawing room, a large, somber chamber lined with oil portraits and heavy furniture, I could not help but feel we were being scrutinized by more than her alert blue eyes. The fire was low in the grate despite the dampness in the air, and a faint smell of lavender polish hung in the air, mingling with something subtler mold, perhaps, or the breath of rooms long shut. "You must forgive the state of things," Catherine said, offering us seats as a silent maid brought in tea. "We are not in the habit of entertaining visitors." Holmes examined the room carefully before speaking. "You wrote of strange happenings, Miss Ellery. Would you begin with the most recent and work backward?" Catherine nodded slowly, her eyes drifting to the tall windows where mist coiled beyond the glass. "3 nights ago," she began, "the housekeeper, Mrs. Grimsby, was returning from the linen room in the west wing when she heard footsteps. Behind her, heavy ones. At first, she assumed it was Jameson, our butler, as he sometimes walks that wing to check the sashes in bad weather. But when she turned, no one was there." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Did she see anything?" "Shadows. Movement? Nothing at all. Just the footsteps. They followed her a while," she said, slow and deliberate. And then silence. She came back white as chalk. Refused to enter the west wing again. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And what lies in the west wing?" "Old family rooms," Catherine said, after a brief hesitation. "Most are unused, now sealed off except for storage. There's also the nursery, though it hasn't seen a child in 20 years. My brows drew together. "Sealed off, you say?" She nodded. "We keep the wing locked most days." Yet the next morning, one of the doors had been opened. No sign of forced entry. Holmes looked intrigued. "Which door?" "To the blue room. It was my uncle's before he died. No one has slept in it since." "And what condition was it found in?" "Unchanged, except..." Her eyes met Holmes's, then drifted to me. "There was a single footprint on the carpet by the hearth, muddy, far too large for Mrs. Grimsby, and not Jameson's he was accounted for that entire night. No one else had a key. Holmes stood abruptly. "Miss Ellery, may I trouble you for a full tour of the West Wing?" "While it's still light." "You may," she said, rising. "But I warn you, the mist creeps in early here, and the house has a way of remembering things." We followed her through a corridor lined with dark oak panels and ancestral paintings that appeared to watch us from under decades of varnish. A pair of brass-handled doors marked the entrance to the West Wing. Catherine withdrew a large iron key from her waist and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a slow, reluctant groan. The West Wing was markedly colder. The air itself felt more ancient. Dust hung like gauze in the sunbeams filtering through high windows. The floorboards creaked beneath our steps. Catherine paused before the blue room, her face stiffening. "Here," she said simply. Holmes stepped inside, and I followed. The room bore the melancholy of a space once cherished and now abandoned. Blue wallpaper, faded to gray in places, covered the walls. A tall four-poster bed loomed to the right. Beside the fireplace was the footprint Catherine had described. A single impression. Dark and distinct, Holmes knelt beside it. "Roughly size 11, he murmured. "Deep at the heel, no drag. It suggests someone tall, moving slowly. Or, with caution, recent rain outside?" "It rained just before dusk that evening," said Catherine. "But the doors and windows here remained shut." "Then either the intruder came from within," Holmes said, "or the room was entered prior to the rain, and the print was left as it dried." He rose and peered into the fireplace. No ashes. "Has this hearth been lit recently?" Catherine shook her head. "Not in years." Holmes checked the window firmly latched. He examined the edges of the doorframe next, then the skirting, boards, and even the space beneath the bed. "Was anything missing?" he asked. "Not that I noticed," Catherine replied. "But then, very little remains of value here." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Value is not always measured." "In pounds sterling, Miss Ellery. May I examine the other rooms?" She led us onward. The nursery came next, still filled with long-forgotten toys and a rocking horse that swayed gently, as though caught in a draft. Holmes touched nothing but looked at everything. In the third room, a small study, he paused beside a writing desk and extracted a yellowed letter tucked behind a drawer. He read it silently and then handed it to me. "My dear Aldous, the voice returned last night. It whispers from the chimney again. I know you'll call it madness, but the words are growing clearer. There is something beneath this house, something old and listening. I beg you seal the flue. I dare not sleep again in that room." Who was R? Holmes asked. Catherine frowned. "I can't be sure. My father's brother, Reginald, perhaps. He spent time in that study before his breakdown." "Breakdown?" He became erratic. Heard voices, claimed the manor was haunted. Eventually, he was taken to a sanatorium, died shortly after. Holmes tapped the edge of the letter thoughtfully. "And the chimney mentioned, does it connect to the blue room?" "Yes, that whole wing shares the same chimney stack." "Curious," Holmes said. More to himself than us. We continued to the end of the corridor, where a final door stood slightly ajar. As Catherine reached for the handle, a sudden thump echoed behind us sharp. Like a falling object, we all turned. Nothing. Just the long corridor stretching behind us. The air still and watching. Holmes motioned for silence and moved back down the hall, examining the skirting, the door frames, even the faint discoloration on the ceiling. "Something fell," I whispered. "Yes," Holmes said. "Or something moved, wanting us to hear it." Back in the blue room, the footprint remained. But now beside it, a second print had appeared, slightly overlapping the first. "My skin prick, lead." Catherine gasped. "I swear, it wasn't there earlier." Holmes crouched again, examining both prints. "They're identical," he said quietly. "Someone wants us to believe they never left." We stood in silence as the fog outside crept up the windows, gray fingers blotting out the light. A bell rang faintly in the main house, and Catherine glanced up. "Dinner," she said. "You must join us. My father will expect it." Holmes turned, his gaze lingering once more on the footprint. "Yes," he said. "I think it's time we met the master of Morton Grange." Chapter 4. The Portrait in the Library the following. Morning. The fog that had blanketed the moors had only grown thicker. It clung to the window panes like gauze and muffled the sounds of birdsong outside. The vast grounds of Grimsby Manor seemed to vanish beyond the glass, leaving only the skeletal outlines of trees and hedges. Holmes stood at the window in our guest chamber, hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the gloom. "A convenient veil," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "For secrets and for those who wish to remain unseen." I had risen early myself, spurred more by the unease of the previous evening than by habit. I had scarcely slept, my mind turning over the strange happenings in the West Wing, the soft but deliberate footsteps we had followed, the locked door, and the spectral chill that had seemed to emanate from that part of the house. "Do you believe the house is truly haunted?" I asked, pouring tea from the ornate silver pot left for us on the side table. Lady Marbury appears quite convinced of it. Holmes turned to me with that glint of bemusement in his eyes, the sort that always preceded a deduction. "My dear Watson," he said, "I have never been one to put stock in phantoms. A sound may echo, a door may creak, but such things rarely occur without cause. If there is a ghost in this house, it has flesh and blood and very possibly motive." He took the cup. I handed him, then added, "And I intend to find out what it is hiding." Later that morning, we joined Lady Marbury and her nephew Cecil for breakfast in the conservatory, a spacious room with high glass walls that allowed what little sunlight there was to filter through the thickening mist. The table had been elegantly laid, though the setting did little to lift the household's somber mood. Lady Marbury, ever graceful, had recovered her composure, but there were still fine lines of worry around her eyes. "I do hope your sleep was not too troubled," she said, stirring her tea. "This house has always had, how shall I put it, an atmosphere." "It was quite atmospheric indeed," Holmes replied, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "The West Wing in particular seemed unusually silent, save for some curious footsteps." "Do you keep staff housed on that side of the manor?" A sudden clatter interrupted them. Cecil had dropped his spoon into his bowl of porridge. His face flushed slightly as he reached for a napkin. I don't believe so," he stammered. "That part of the manor has been sealed for years." "On whose orders?" Holmes asked mildly. "My father's after my uncle. George's death, no one wanted to disturb his old study." "An interesting decision," Holmes mused. "Grief often closes doors, literally and metaphorically. And yet, human curiosity is rarely so restrained." Lady Marbury interjected with a gentle firmness. "I must ask, Mr. Holmes, if your inquiries can be kept discreet. I would rather not upset the household unnecessarily." "Discretion is my profession," Holmes replied with a slight bow dot after breakfast. Holmes requested a tour of the manor, under the pretense of admiring its architectural history. Lady Marbury obliged, assigning the housekeeper, Mrs. Weatherby, to escort us. A brisk and tight-lipped woman, Mrs. Weatherby led us through the manor with a mechanical efficiency, unlocking doors with a keyring that jangled ominously at her hip dot as we entered the grand library, a vaulted room paneled in dark walnut with 2 floors of shelves and a sweeping spiral staircase. Holmes paused beneath an enormous oil painting mounted above the fireplace. It was a portrait of a man in military uniform, eyes sharp, mouth unsmiling. "Colonel George Marbury, I presume?" Holmes asked. "Indeed," Mrs. Weatherby confirmed. "That was painted the year before he died. A stern man, the colonel. Very exacting." Holmes examined the painting with great interest, stepping back and forth. Curious placement, he murmured, tracing a gloved finger along the edge of the frame. Tell me, Mrs. Weatherby, has this always hung here? To my knowledge, yes, though I believe it was moved from the drawing room decades ago. Holmes's gaze slid to the fireplace below the portrait, then to the hearth and stone surround. Have there been any renovations here in recent years? He asked. No, sir. The Marburys are rather traditional. Nothing's been changed in my 23 years here. Holmes turned to me with an expectant look. Watson, would you kindly assist me in moving this chaise longue? We shifted the heavy furniture aside. Holmes then knelt at a worn patch of carpet and began inspecting the floorboards, lifting a loose corner. What do you suspect? I asked. I suspect, he replied softly, that the Colonel may have kept more than books in this library. With some effort, he pried up a warped floorboard. Beneath, wrapped in layers of oilskin, was a long, narrow metal case. He opened it gently. Inside, gleaming faintly in the filtered light, lay a dueling pistol and a small stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Mrs. Weatherby gasped. I never knew. How long has that been there? Holmes lifted the pistol, inspecting its barrel and trigger. This is no museum piece. It has been cleaned recently. The letters, yellowed but well preserved, were addressed in a delicate hand. To G.M. Holmes replaced everything carefully and returned the board to its place. I believe, he said to Mrs. Weatherby, that you've just helped us find our first real lead. That afternoon, Holmes and I sat in our private chamber, the pistol case open before us. Holmes read the letters with clinical focus, handing each one to me as he finished. They were, to our surprise, love letters, warm, heartfelt, and tinged with secrecy. The author, a woman only identified by her initial C, spoke of secret meetings, promises made and broken, and finally, betrayal. One passage stood out starkly. You said you would defy your brother for me, but now you say it must be hidden. What does that make me, a shadow in your grand house? I will not be dismissed like a servant. If you do not come to me by the 1st of October, I shall come to you. Consequences be damned. What do you make of it, Holmes? I asked. He folded the final letter carefully and placed it back in the case. I believe, Watson, that the good colonel was playing a dangerous game. One that may not have ended in war, but in scandal, and possibly murder. He stood, his expression unreadable. We must learn the identity of C, and more urgently, whether she ever arrived at Grimsby Manor. Chapter 5. Whispers Beneath. The floorboards, the mist still hung thick over Grimsby Manor as the afternoon crept into early evening, dimming the already gloom-laden corridors into something nearly spectral. Holmes and I sat opposite one another in the drawing room, the very room, I later learned, where Colonel Marbury had once hosted his military companions in more convivial times. Now it bore a chill, despite the low fire crackling in the grate. Holmes had placed the letters from the mysterious C beside the pistol case on the side table. He was not a man given to sentiment, but I could see in his eyes that he had not discounted the emotional stakes of the affair. The tone of these letters, Holmes said, folding his hands beneath his chin, is not one of fleeting flirtation. There is too much desperation, too much threat veiled within the ink. You suspect blackmail? I offered. Perhaps. Or something darker. He stood suddenly and began pacing. It is clear that C believed herself wronged, either betrayed or discarded. A woman in love, Watson, when deceived, may wield sharper weapons than reason. If she came here as the letter threatened, it would explain why George Marbury grew reclusive in the final months of his life. But surely, I said, if a woman came to the house and a confrontation occurred, something violent, perhaps, would not someone have noticed? Holmes gave a thin smile. You give the staff too much credit. Loyalty, fear, or money can all be powerful silencers. No, if something happened to her here, the manor itself might remember, even if its residents will not admit it. We requested to speak once again with Mrs. Weatherby, who joined us in the drawing room a half hour later, her keys jingling at her waist like a jailer's. Mrs. Weatherby. Holmes began without preamble. We have reason to believe a woman, not a servant, came to visit Colonel Marbury shortly before his death. Would you know anything of such a visitor? The housekeeper's brow furrowed. Not to my recollection, Mr. Holmes, though the Colonel received few visitors in those days. He was troubled, I think. Not quite himself. Troubled how? There were nights we'd hear shouting from the library. Once, I passed by the door and heard him arguing, but when I knocked, he claimed he was reading aloud, alone. And no one else ever stayed overnight during that time. No mention of a sea? She paused, thoughtful. Well, there was a woman, now that you mention it. Arrived without a letter or calling card. This would have been September, I believe, a week before the Colonel took to his bed. She was turned away at the door, but I remember her name because she left it with me in case the Colonel came to his senses, she said. Holmes leaned in, his interest piqued. Her name? Clara Wetherall. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. And you told no one of this? The housekeeper's chin lifted. I didn't see it as my place. She was distressed. I thought it a private matter. Holmes tapped the mantel thoughtfully. Very well. That's all, Mrs. Weatherby. You've been most helpful. When she left, Holmes turned to me. Clara Wetherall. The signature fits. But more than that, her arrival coincides with the Colonel's downward spiral. Whatever occurred between them, Watson, likely did not end in reconciliation. Later that evening, Holmes proposed an unusual course of action. We must explore the West Wing again, he said. There is more to that locked corridor than merely dust and grief. If there are answers in this house, they will be behind that door. But Holmes, I said, it was bolted. Lady Marbury said even she does not possess the key. True, he said, already retrieving a length of thin steel wire from his traveling case. But the deadbolt is old, and the wood swollen with time. I dare say it will not withstand two men with determination and tools. We waited until the household had quieted. The clock had just struck 11. Then took a shaded lantern and crept silently through the unlit halls. The house creaked and sighed with age. The mist outside pressed against the windows, turning every pane into a dim mirror dot. At the end of the West Wing corridor, we found the door. Ancient oak, iron hinges rusted, and the lock black with age. Holmes knelt and examined it by lantern light. Poor maintenance, he whispered. All to our advantage. It took him only minutes. The lock gave a reluctant click, and the door groaned open an inch. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and something fainter. Perfume, perhaps, once sweet but now aged into a cloying mustiness. We stepped in, our lantern casting long shadows across faded wallpaper and furniture draped in white sheets. This must have been the Colonel's private study, I said. Holmes moved with care, trailing his fingers along the edges of the desk. The bookshelves, the fireplace. In one corner of the room, a wardrobe stood half open. He pulled it wider. Inside hung a single military coat, dust-covered but intact. Beneath it, a worn leather satchel. Holmes opened it, revealing more letters, these addressed to dearest Clara. They were lovers indeed, I murmured. More than lovers, Holmes corrected softly. The language here. It's the writing of a man who feared losing everything. His position, his brother's approval, even his name. He removed the letter and read aloud. They will never allow it, Clara. My brother watches me like a hawk. If I could give it all up, I would. But I am a prisoner of duty. Holmes pocketed the letters carefully. Watson, he said after a moment, bring the lantern here. I followed him to a section of the wooden floor near the fireplace. Holmes had noticed something subtle, a dip in the floorboards, and what looked like a faint outline of a trapdoor. He took a blade from his coat and worked the edge gently. With a groan, the floor panel shifted upward, revealing a dark, narrow space below. I held the lantern over the hole, and we both peered in. The space was small, like a root cellar, and littered with discarded objects. A wine bottle, a broken cane, and a silk scarf so pale it almost seemed to glow. But at the far end, partly buried under dust and time, something glinted faintly. A silver brooch, shaped like a butterfly. Holmes reached down and retrieved it. He held it up in the lantern light. "Watson," he said, his voice low. "This belonged to Clara. It's engraved. CW." "You believe she died here?" I asked. "Not necessarily, but she was here. And not willingly." We closed the trapdoor and left the room undisturbed. Back in our quarters, Holmes laid the brooch beside the letters on the table, his expression more serious than I had seen it in days. "The Manor," he said, "holds a secret burial, not of bones perhaps, but of truth. And if we do not unearth it soon, Watson, I fear it will be buried forever." Chapter 6. The Mark of the Night Visitor. The following morning brought with it no reprieve from the ever-present mist that choked the grounds of Grimsby Manor. A damp grayness pressed against every window pane, and the silence within the house, that peculiar silence one only finds in old country estates, had acquired a watchful edge, as though the very walls had taken to listening. Holmes had slept little. At dawn, I found him in our shared sitting room, bent over the brooch, the fire barely warming the air. The silver gleamed faintly in his hand. "This piece," he murmured, "was likely torn from its owner. The clasp is bent. See here, Watson," as if it were pulled away in haste or struggle. I leaned closer. The initials CW were indeed delicate and fine, etched with care. Holmes's voice grew quiet. She was here. Clara Wetherall. Not merely for a confrontation, but possibly imprisoned or worse. Yet no one in this household will admit to seeing her, save the housekeeper who claims she never passed the front hall. Then how did she get into the West Wing? I asked. "That," said Holmes, standing, "is the question we must answer. And we shall begin with the one person who has evaded us thus far, young William, the stable boy." We found William in the rear courtyard, brushing down one of the marais. He straightened quickly at our approach, but there was something tight in his movements, a flicker of unease behind his freckled face. Holmes's tone was affable, but I knew the sharpness beneath it. "Good morning, William. A cold one, wouldn't you say?" The boy nodded, eyes flitting from Holmes to me and back again. "We're hoping to ask you something," Holmes continued, reaching into his coat and drawing out the butterfly brooch. "Have you seen this before?" William's face drained of color. "No, sir. Can't say I have." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You answered too quickly. Try again." The boy bit his lip, then looked over his shoulder toward the manor. I saw it once. Not that exact one, but one just like it, on a woman. She came one evening, just before the colonel fell ill." Holmes leaned in slightly. "What time?" "Late," said William. "After dark. She didn't come to the front. She came up through the orchard, all cloaked up, like she didn't want to be seen. I was tending the tack room. She looked lost or scared." "What happened?" "I went to fetch Mrs. Weatherby, but when I came back, the woman was gone. Door to the West Wing was ajar, though I swear it had been locked before." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "So she entered by her own means?" William looked troubled. "That wing ... it's odd. Always locked, always quiet, but sometimes ... double quotes." He hesitated. "Sometimes I heard movement, steps maybe, at night." "Did you report this to anyone?" The boy's voice dropped. "No, because they'd say it was the wind, or rats, or worse. Accuse me of making things up, but I know what I heard." Holmes nodded, offering a small, approving smile. "You've been very helpful, William. One last question. Did you ever see her leave?" The boy hesitated. "No, sir. Never saw her again. Back in the manor, Holmes's pace increased. He strode through the halls like a hound on the scent, finally pausing outside the West Wing corridor once more. The door, still slightly ajar from our visit the previous night, groaned faintly in the cold air. Inside, everything remained undisturbed, but Holmes's eyes were drawn not to the trapdoor, nor the desk, but the fireplace. He crouched and examined the hearthstone, brushing away ash and soot with a cloth. "Watson," he said, "come look." There, just beneath the grate, were markings, not random scratches but letters. Scorched into the stone, half covered in ash, they formed one word: lead. "It's a message," I said, my breath catching. Holmes nodded. "But not meant for George Marbury. This was scratched in haste by someone desperate. It is Clara's." Voice silent until now. "And yet," I said slowly, "if she was kept here, locked in, who could have hidden her without the knowledge of the family?" Holmes stood, brushing his hands. "There are too many variables, too many shadows, but the net is tightening." He turned toward the doorway. "And I believe it is time we speak to Mr. Julian Marbury." Julian Marbury was found in the study, hunched over correspondence and sipping a brandy he had clearly started far too early in the day, Mr. Holmes, he said coolly. "I was told you were prying about the West Wing last night. Not exactly subtle, are you?" Holmes bowed slightly. "Only those with secrets fear subtlety, Mr. Marbury." Julian's brow darkened. "Are you implying I've something to hide?" "I imply nothing. I only question what you might know of a woman named Clara Wetherall." At the sound of the name, Julian paled, though he quickly tried to mask it with irritation. "She was a passing folly of my brother's, a distraction, beneath his status." "Yet," Holmes replied, "you thought her significant enough to warn your brother against, didn't you? These letters," he placed them gently on the table, "suggest that you intervened more directly than you. Admit." Julian's lips thinned. "I tried to protect my brother's name. He was a war hero. His reputation mattered. I told him to end it. And did he?" Holmes pressed. "Or did she come here, seeking him, and vanish shortly after?" Julian rose to his feet. "Now see here. I've indulged your interference long enough. My brother's death was tragic, yes, but a natural one. This obsession of yours with Clara is foolish. She left, that's all. But you cannot prove that, can you?" Julian's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. After a moment, he strode out of the room, slamming the door behind him. We spent the evening reviewing all Holmes had gathered, the letters, the brooch, the scorched message, the boy's testimony. "There is something wrong in this house, Watson," Holmes said at last. "Too many people wish to bury the truth. The key to this mystery lies not just in who Clara was, but what she knew, and why someone wanted her silenced." Outside, the mist thickened again, curling like smoke against the windows. I thought of the word burned into the hearthstone. Lied. We were being warned, or beckoned, and I knew, as did Holmes, that the truth waited somewhere deep within the manor's rotten shadow, and it would not stay hidden forever. Chapter 7. Secrets beneath the floorboards. The next morning arrived not with clarity, but with an even heavier shroud of fog that pressed close to the windows of Grimsby Manor. The chimneys stood like lonely sentinels, spewing coils of gray into the cold air, and the garden, once visible from the parlor, had all but vanished behind. A wall of white homes, and I took a subdued breakfast in the drawing room. Our plates barely touched. Mrs. Weatherby brought in toast and kippers without a word, and her eyes flicked to Holmes with something close to wariness before she quietly withdrew. Holmes sipped his tea, frowning toward the fire. The message Clara left lead implies not just betrayal, he mused, but deliberate deception. Someone went to great lengths to make it seem she never arrived here. I stirred my tea absent-mindedly. And yet William saw her. The west wing door was found ajar. The brooch was discovered in a place no guest would reach. And Julian, Holmes interrupted, knows more than he admitted. But he is not the only one keeping secrets. He rose suddenly. Come, Watson. There's something about that trapdoor we missed. Back in the West Wing chamber, the cold had grown more intense, as though the very room exhaled frost. The boarded-up window allowed in a narrow shaft of wan light, which fell like a pale blade across the desk. Holmes crouched once again by the iron ring embedded in the floor. With a grunt, he lifted the trapdoor, revealing the same shallow cavity, lined with bricks and old soot. He removed the contents we'd found previously, an extinguished candle stub, a rusted metal spoon, and a length of worn linen. But this time, he examined the wood itself. Look closely, Watson, he said, pointing. See here, scratches, not natural ones, but carved. I knelt beside him. At the very edge of the opening, where the floor met the base of the trapdoor, someone had etched markings into the timber. Faint, but unmistakable. Find beneath, Holmes's. Eyes glittered, a message, hidden in plain sight. Beneath what? Holmes stood, his gaze sweeping the room. He walked slowly to the far corner, where a threadbare carpet half covered the floor. With swift precision, he pulled it aside. Beneath was a panel of discolored boards, subtly different from the rest. He took out his knife and slid the blade into the join between two boards. With a sharp creak, one gave way, revealing a narrow hollow. Inside lay a faded leather SATCHEL. Holmes withdrew it and set it carefully on the desk. Dust coated its surface, and the metal clasp had nearly rusted through. With a delicate touch, he opened it. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Letters, sketches, and a slim journal. Holmes thumbed through the pages, reading rapidly, eyes scanning with practiced intensity. These are hers, he murmured. Clara's. And this, he held up a letter marked in a fine, elegant hand, is a confession. I leaned over as he read aloud. To whomever finds this, know that I did not come to Grimsby to threaten or blackmail. I came to warn Edward. I had discovered something terrible, something hidden beneath this house, not metaphorically, but quite literally. I believe it was the reason for his increasing illness, for his madness in those final days. He had found it too. He wrote of it in his last letter to me, but it was never posted. It remains here somewhere, though Julian denied ever seeing it. If I disappear, let it be known. They lied. They all lied. My breath caught. Something hidden beneath the house? Could she mean the cellars? Possibly, Holmes said, already, flipping through more of the journal. But more than that, it suggests Edward's death was not illness, but murder, and that Clara may have discovered the means by which it was accomplished. He turned to the final page. There, hastily scrawled, was a rough sketch of a room, stone walls, shelves of jars, a strange contraption with coils and tubes. She describes a chamber beneath the west wing, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. One Edward had discovered during renovations, and that Julian insisted was sealed up. According to her notes, Edward believed it dated back to the original foundations of the estate, long before the manor took its current shape. And what of the contraption? I asked. Holmes studied the drawing. Alchemy, perhaps. Or chemistry. This device, he pointed to the tubes, is not unlike a distillation apparatus. Perhaps something more sinister. Look here. The word mercury appears several times in the margins. I felt a chill pass through me. She believed he was being poisoned, I said. Holmes nodded gravely. And that someone close to him was orchestrating it. As we exited the west wing, we found Mrs. Weatherby standing at the top of the staircase, a tray in her hands and an unreadable expression on her face. I brought tea, she said carefully, but you weren't in your room. Holmes took a step forward. Mrs. Weatherby, might I ask, did you ever see Colonel Edward in the weeks before his death enter the west wing? She hesitated. Once, just once. He was pale, trembling. He said he'd been exploring an old part of the manor, but that it made him feel unwell. He asked me for lemon water. Said he had the shakes. Holmes gave her a long look. "And you?" Didn't question it. She looked down. It wasn't my place. But I did tell Mr. Julian. He said Edward had always been prone to nerves. And Clara? I never saw her. But I heard things, voices in the night. Once, I found Muddy. Footprints in the corridor outside the wing. They vanished halfway down. I scrubbed them clean. Holmes glanced at me. She was here longer than we thought. Hidden. Trapped, perhaps. Mrs. Weatherby's fingers tightened around the tray. "You should leave this place, Mr. Holmes. The manor is old, and it remembers what's been done within it." That night, Holmes spread Clara's documents across the writing desk in our room. The final letter, the drawing, the pages of the journal, they all pointed to something buried in the bowels of Grimsby Manor. "We must find the chamber," he said, "before someone else ensures we never do." A floorboard creaked in the corridor outside. We both turned .silence, then a knock .3. Soft raps. Holmes crossed to the door and opened it .no one. Only the mist curling like fingers down the corridor. The floor at our feet, a single piece of paper. Folded, plain. Holmes stooped, opened it. A single word written in thick black ink. "Stop. Chapter 8. The whisper of the forgotten chamber morning did not arrive so much as seep into the manor like a reluctant visitor, pushing back the night only with great effort. The fog outside had thickened. Still further, so that the trees beyond the garden stood like spectral sentinels in a world of white. Holmes had not slept. When I stirred at dawn, he was still seated by the hearth, the fire now embers, Clara's journal splayed open across, his knees and his gaze fixed on the floor as though reading some invisible trail. He looked up as I rubbed sleep from my eyes. "Watson, time is pressing." I sat up. "You believe the chamber Clara described still exists. I believe it was deliberately hidden after Edward's death. I believe Julian either sealed it himself or allowed someone else to do so. And I believe Clara stumbled upon it and was silenced." My brow furrowed. But where? The manor is vast, and we've yet to find any staircase or entrance that leads deeper beneath the west wing. Holmes stood. "Then we shall make one." By mid-morning, we were back in the west wing, armed with lanterns, a pribar, and the journal pages folded neatly in Holmes's coat. He had studied Clara's sketch of the chamber through the night, and noted the approximate orientation of the door within the drawing. Holmes paced the floor of the corridor just outside the chamber, tapping lightly on the boards with the butt of the lantern. Then, a dull thunk. He crouched. "Here." We pried up the boards to find an ancient flagstone floor beneath, discolored and cracked. One stone, slightly raised and uneven, caught Holmes's attention. He knelt beside it, ran his fingers along the edge, and produced a thin knife from his pocket. With deft pressure, he slipped the blade into a crevice. A click sounded, faint but unmistakable, and then the stone shifted, revealing a dark hole beneath. A puff of stale, mineral-scented air rose up. Holmes lit his lantern. "The forgotten breath of the manor," he murmured. "Shall we?" The stone steps descended into pitch blackness, curling in a narrow spiral. The walls were slick with condensation, the scent of earth and iron thick in the air. Cobwebs fluttered in the lantern's glow. Each step creaked with age and neglect, and I found myself drawing my coat closer. At last we emerged into a low chamber, stone-walled, the ceiling arched and reinforced with timber beams, slick with moss. The room was eerily familiar, a perfect match to Clara's drawing. A long work table stood near the far wall, covered in broken glassware, flasks, tubes, and coils now shattered and coated in dust. Shelves along one side of the chamber contained crumbling books, most warped by moisture. Holmes moved slowly, examining everything, brushing away cobwebs. This was Edward's hidden laboratory. Clara was telling the truth. He paused at the table. Here, the residue on this dish. He ran his finger along a porcelain bowl and held it to the lantern. Silvery, thick, almost metallic. Mercury? I asked. Or a compound containing it, Holmes replied. This room was his undoing. Poison, absorbed slowly, through vapor, ingestion, or both. And someone ensured it happened. I moved toward a small writing desk tucked in the corner. The drawers were locked, but Holmes produced a set of tools and within moments had them open. Inside was a bundle of letters, sealed, addressed to Clara. One remained unsent, the seal broken. Holmes opened it carefully and read aloud. Clara, I have uncovered something terrible. The vapors here, I can feel them in my blood, my mind. I know now that Julian lied. He knew of this place before I showed him. He warned me to leave it sealed, said it was part of the house's foundations. But why did he come here alone the night before I fell ill? If I perish, know it was not by accident. Burn these notes, leave Grimsby. Holmes folded the letter. Edward was murdered, and Julian is the likely culprit? I said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. There's motive, certainly. Inheritance, ambition, perhaps envy. But I am not yet convinced he acted alone or first. We ascended. The steps in silence, heavy with the knowledge of what had lain beneath Grimsby for so long. As Holmes replaced the floorboard with care, footsteps echoed from down the hall. Julian stood there, his coat collar turned up, his expression unreadable. You've been busy, he said. Holmes straightened. The West Wing holds secrets, Mr. Grimsby. Secrets you would have done better to disclose. Julian's voice turned cold. I told you, I had the wing sealed for safety. It was my brother's madness. He thought he saw ghosts, heard things beneath the floor. But there was never any danger, just rot and ruin. You mean the rot of conscience, Holmes replied quietly. He was poisoned, slowly, precisely. He suspected you. Julian flinched, just slightly. How dare you? I loved my brother. And yet you left his final letters to Clara unopened, Holmes said, stepping closer. You sealed the room where he suffered. You lied about her ever coming here. Julian's jaw tightened. I was protecting the family name, or your inheritance. Have you any proof? He snapped. Holmes studied him coolly. Not yet. But the house is beginning to speak. That evening, the fog pressed more thickly than ever before. And the mood inside the manor was one of barely concealed dread. Holmes and I reviewed the journal, letters, and chemical evidence in our room, while Julian took dinner alone in the dining hall. A soft knock came at our door. Mrs. Weatherby. She stepped. Inside, clutching something in her hand, a folded piece of faded paper. I found this just now, she whispered. It was tucked into the back of a book in the library. I don't know how long it's been there. Holmes opened it. A map, crude but recognizable. It showed the manor's foundations and an extension beneath the east wing, marked with the word vault. Beneath that, written in an unfamiliar hand. They brought it here in 1842. Buried it when the screaming wouldn't stop. Holmes looked up, and for the first time since we'd arrived, his expression was not curious but grim. There is something else buried at Grimsby, he said softly. And whatever it is, it predates the murder. Possibly even the manor itself. Chapter 9. The vault beneath the east wing. The manor seemed to hold its breath as we gathered once more in our sitting room. Holmes, myself, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Weatherby, who stood trembling in the firelight. The fog outside had thickened into an impenetrable curtain. A steady wind sighed through the eaves, and a rhythmic drip echoed somewhere deep within the walls. Holmes sat hunched over the crude map Mrs. Weatherby had discovered, his brow furrowed in sharp concentration. The paper, though aged and brittle, bore clear indications of the manor's layout, but with certain features that no current blueprint of Grimsby House displayed. Chief among them, the passage leading beneath, the east wing to a space labeled vault, What could possibly be buried beneath the east wing? I asked, pacing. Holmes traced the ink with a gloved finger. This portion of the structure predates the west wing by decades, perhaps a century or more. The note reads, they brought it here in 1842, buried it when the screaming wouldn't stop. That suggests something, or someone was entombed down there, against their will. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her shawl tighter. Sir, I fear, whatever lies beneath, it isn't meant to be disturbed. Old Mr. Grimsby, the grandfather, forbade any digging under that wing. Even the groundsmen were warned. Holmes glanced at her. Warnings and secrets often walk hand in hand, Mrs. Weatherby. And secrets, once buried, tend to fester. He rose. We must see it tonight. Shortly after midnight, when the manor had gone quiet and even the creaking of the floorboards above had ceased, Holmes, lantern in hand, led us down a narrow corridor behind the library, when I had scarcely noticed in daylight. With every step, the air grew colder, the stone underfoot damper. Our boots echoed faintly. We halted before a low wooden door recessed into the farthest wall. It was iron-braced and bore no handle, only a carved emblem faded by time, a serpent. Coiled around a chalice, Holmes studied it carefully, curious. The caduceus, but altered. It may signify alchemy or medicine turned malevolent. Using his tools, Holmes located a concealed latch hidden behind a wooden panel to the right. A spring released with a snap, and the door creaked open on ancient hinges, exhaling a gust of sour, musty air that extinguished my lantern flame. Only Holmes's remained lit. We descended a narrow set of steps into the vault. The chamber, beneath the east wing, was far larger than the forgotten laboratory under the west. Its ceiling vaulted high above, supported by damp stone arches. The walls were lined with niches, most of them empty, but some filled with crates sealed in wax or old iron chests, bound with rusted chains. And in the center, a raised stone dais. Upon it, a large leaden box, flanked by 2 iron candlesticks and a tarnished crucifix. Holmes approached slowly, light playing across the box's sealed surface. There were inscriptions, Latin most of them, and a name carved at the foot. Of the dais, Juliana Grimsby, 1799 to 1842. I stepped back instinctively. She died the same year the note referred to. And perhaps not of natural causes, Holmes murmured. He knelt, brushing away decades of dust and mildew. One corner of the box bore a small fracture, a jagged crack as though something had attempted to force its way out from within. Mrs. Weatherby gasped softly. I've heard the name Juliana whispered by the older staff. They say she was mad, that she screamed night and day, that the family locked her away in a stone room. Until she died. Or until she was silenced, Holmes said. He stood, stepping back, his expression unreadable. This isn't merely a family vault, it's a prison. We remained in the chamber for nearly an hour, examining the contents of several crates and alcoves. Holmes discovered several glass vials wrapped in cloth, sealed with black wax and labeled in precise Latin script. Old tinctures, perhaps, or alchemical compounds. One crate contained papers nearly dissolved by time, but among them Holmes recovered a thin volume, Liber de Umbris, a treatise on shadows and the mind, banned in most English libraries of the 19th century. There's a pattern here, he mused as we emerged back into the corridor. Poison, madness, secrets buried beneath this house like roots twisting around a corpse. The Grimsby line is tangled in something darker than greed or ambition. As we returned to our chamber, the manor seemed colder, heavier. The fog had crept into the corridors, trailing along the floor like pale fingers. Even the candles flickered as though struggling to stay alight. Holmes placed the recovered items on the desk and turned to me. Watson, the question is no longer, who killed Edward? It's why Clara Grimsby had to be silenced. She was unraveling something older than Edward's death, older than even Julian. He held up the page from Liber de Umbris, Clara found the vault long before we did. And she may have uncovered what happened to Juliana, I frowned. But what connection could a woman dead for nearly a century have with the recent murders? Holmes's gaze turned toward the fog-pressed window. Sometimes, Watson, families inherit more than fortunes. They inherit guilt, madness, and fear. And at Grimsby Manor, all three seemed to linger. Just then, a distant sound froze us both. A single note, faint but unmistakable. A piano key struck in the dead of night. We turned as one. The parlor was locked. No one had entered it since our arrival. Holmes moved swiftly, throwing open the door. The grand piano stood silent, untouched. A fine layer of dust on the keys. Except for one. The E above middle CPR, ESSED, down. Still depressed, Holmes said nothing. He walked slowly to the instrument and released the key. It sprang back into place with a faint click. No one else was in the room. And the air was still. We returned to our chamber in silence. I watched as Holmes sat at the desk once more, staring at Clara's journal, the recovered book, and the map. Then, softly, almost to himself, he said, Clara followed the trail to the vault. She connected Juliana to Edward's sickness, and she must have written something down, something she planned to send. He looked up at me. Watson, I believe the key to all of this lies not only in what we've found, but in what we haven't. There's a page missing from Clara's journal. A final entry. And someone went to great lengths to destroy it. Chapter 10. The missing page. The morning arrived reluctantly. A bleak dawn crept over the moor, the sun choked by mist as thick as suet. Grimsby Manor awoke not with bustling servants, or clattering dishes, but with the hush of dread that had become its constant companion. Even the air within seemed reluctant to stir, as though the walls themselves were listening. Holmes was already dressed and at the writing desk when I awoke, poring over Clara Grimsby's journal once more. The lamplight caught the glint of his glass lens, one eye trained on the final written page. It ended mid-sentence. If I am correct, then the true cause of Edward's suffering lies not in his temperament, nor in any illness of the blood, but in a clean tear marked the edge. Someone had removed the page deliberately, carefully, not the hurried violence of panic, but the calculated neatness of someone trying to erase a truth. Holmes leaned back, tapping the journal lightly with his finger. They took it not to keep it, but to prevent others from finding it. Whoever removed that page knew it would expose the heart of this mystery. I nodded. And if Clara sent a copy to someone else, then it is a race between us and the killer to retrieve it, he said, rising abruptly. Watson, the post. Ledgers. The what? Clara may have entrusted the information to someone beyond this house, someone she hoped would act if she could not. If she posted a letter or package in the last days before her death, it may have been recorded. We must speak to the village postmaster at once. By midday, we were trudging down the lane into the village of Renly, the heavy sky sagging. Low over the moor, fog clung to the hedgerows, curling around fence posts like ghostly tendrils. The post office, a squat stone building nestled between the grocer's and the chapel, bore the faded red sign of Royal Mail and a cracked window. Covered with OILSKIN. Mr. Beach, the postmaster, a rotund man with whiskers like an agitated badger, greeted us with suspicion until Holmes presented his credentials and mentioned Clara Grimsby. Yes, I remember her, Beach said, shuffling to the back shelves. Very polite she was. Came in 3 times the week before her accident, or what they say was an accident. Holmes's eyes narrowed. 3 times? Aye, Beach replied. The first 2 were standard letters, one to her cousin in Torquay, another to her solicitor in London. But the last time, well, that was peculiar. She handed me a package. Not large, but heavy. Said it must be posted that very day, no delays. Paid for special courier service. Holmes leaned forward. Do you remember where it was addressed? Beach scratched his ear, then retrieved the ledger. Flipping through the pages, he tapped. His finger on an entry dated 2 days before Clara's death. Here, sent to Professor Silas Bramble, Oxford. A rare book dealer and antiquarian, I believe. Strange name, but I've posted to him before. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. That may be our missing page. We returned to the manor by early afternoon, just as a fresh drizzle began. Holmes sent a telegram to Bramble at once, marked urgent, requesting confirmation of receipt and a copy of the contents if the package had survived. Back at Grimsby House, the atmosphere had darkened further. A strange stillness had settled over the servants. Whispers halted when we entered rooms. The piano had remained untouched, and yet several keys bore fresh fingerprints. Someone is watching us. Watson, Holmes said, not looking up from the fire. And not from outside, from within. That evening, Holmes convened a quiet conversation in the study, calling in only those most connected to the case. Mrs. Weatherby, young Charles Grimsby, and Edward's brother, Lucian, who had returned. Late from London the previous evening, Lucian Grimsby was tall, silver-haired, and cold-eyed. The sort of man who could hold a grudge as tightly as he held his wine glass. He had inherited the family fortune, and by all accounts, the family. Pride. I hope you don't mean to suggest, he said with a sneer, that my sister-in-law was murdered over superstition and shadows. Holmes ignored the tone. I suggest that Clara Grimsby uncovered something the family has long kept hidden. Something beneath this house. Lucian's eyes narrowed. You've been beneath the east wing? Briefly, Holmes replied. We found what remained of Juliana Grimsby. A flicker there in Lucian's face, a tensing of the jaw. He said nothing. Did you know of her? Holmes asked gently. Lucian's voice was flat. Every family has ghosts, Mr. Holmes. Ours are simply older than most. Holmes turned to Charles. Did your aunt ever mention Juliana to you? Charles hesitated. Only once. I had nightmares as a boy. She told me not to be frightened. Said the woman in the walls would never hurt me unless she was called. Holmes leaned forward. Called? How? But Charles only shook his head. I thought she was joking. Late that night, Holmes stood at the window, watching the fog slide. Across the moor. She's coming for us, Watson. Who? Not Juliana. The truth, he paced. The cracks are forming. Charles knows more than he realizes. Lucian knows more than he admits. And someone, perhaps both, have touched that piano after midnight. I glanced at the sealed crates from the vault, still unopened. We need that missing page. I said dot just then. A sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Weatherby stood pale, holding an envelope. This came just now, sir. From Oxford. Holmes took it, tore it open. Inside, a letter from Professor Bramble. Mr. Holmes. The package did arrive, though its wrapping was damaged in transit. Inside I found a single page, water-stained but legible. Clara's hand, I believe. It spoke of a chamber beneath Grimsby House, and of her belief that Juliana Grimsby was neither mad nor ill, but poisoned deliberately by her family. That the same symptoms later plagued Edward. She claimed she had discovered records from an apothecary in Renly who sold rare tonics to Mr. Horace Grimsby in 1841. That same formula, she believed, was being prepared again. She named no culprit. But the final line chilled me. If I am found dead, know that it was not illness nor grief, but murder, repeating its own history. Professor Silas Bramble Holmes exhaled slowly. She knew, he said. She knew exactly what happened to Edward, and someone in this house is repeating a crime committed 80 years ago.